Alright, so let's talk about Chargers players and how relevant they are to your fantasy team. And I know what you're thinking, most of you have probably drafted your team by now and don't care. The thing is, a lot of Chargers players are going to be available on waivers, and I think some of them are going to end up being pretty good. And I'm not just saying that because I lollygag on making this video, I actually mean it. So let's take a look at the best Chargers fantasy options and consider where and when they're worth taking, and when and where you should subscribe to the channel, which is right now and wherever you are. Also, I just want to shout out the 2,000 or so people who've watched my comeback video. I was definitely expecting a tepid reception, which is fair because, I haven't posted anything in months, so gotta say, really appreciate it. First up, let's start with the most obvious draft pick from the Chargers this year, and that's Justin Herbert. After 2 disappointing injury-filled seasons, technically the one season he did play, but he didn't play as well with the injury, Herbert has definitely dropped down a lot of fantasy ranking. According to Draft Sharks, his ADP is around the middle of the 11th round. I've even heard chatter that in a lot of leagues he's gone undrafted. If you're in one of those leagues, pick him the fuck up. Obviously, this comes with the caveat that I would have definitely been more excited about his season, pre-Plenter, whatever. I don't want to even embarrass myself trying to pronounce it. All you have to do is really look at the history of Greg Roman and his quarterbacks. And generally you see really good fantasy seasons. Yes, they run the ball a lot, but the quarterback is part of the running, which does get you fantasy points. And his offenses tend to throw a high rate of TDs using play action. So even if he's not getting much passing yards, he's still getting TDs, which are worth a lot of points. Of course, some of the rushing potential might be limited because of the injury. But then again, are we sure it's going to? Because it sounds like it's a pain threshold thing, so I wouldn't put it past Herbert ice bathing it away and putting together a pretty great fantasy season. Either way, if you haven't drafted him yet, or you're in a league where someone could trade you him, I would go for it. I feel like he ends up a top 10 QB by the end of the year, fantasy-wise. I think the second most obvious Chargers player to draft this year is Gus Edwards, aka the Gus Bus. I think there's a lot of trepidation around Gus Edwards because he's obviously part of a platoon, and the Chargers have gone out of their way to reinforce that it's a platoon with a 1A and 1B on their depth chart. But I'm not worried about it. The reason being, I know where his points are coming from. So even if J.K. Dobbins has a similar amount of stats, or maybe even more than Gus Edwards, I still think he ends up being the better fantasy player this year. And my thesis around that is he's just going to get more touchdowns. It's that simple. Last year with Lamar Jackson as his QB, he had 13 touchdowns. Previous to that, his numbers weren't that impressive, which makes sense because you have Lamar Jackson at quarterback. Famously, Herbert's not the best at the QB sneak, so I can see him handing off to Edwards a lot just to avoid another I'm in moment. Next up, let's talk about the most boring Chargers fantasy pick, and that's Josh Palmer. And I'm not saying he's boring because he's kind of sort of Canadian, but it's because he's kind of mid. Like, he's not bad, but he doesn't really excel in any area really as a receiver. He's just solid, good blocker, and maybe that keeps him on the field a lot and he's able to be productive. I can see it, but I can also see his blocking ability being used. Receivers blocking are a very big part of the Roman offense, though in his defense, he is the most seasoned receiver, so it seems like it would make sense that he ended up being the most productive. But I honestly see him being added and dropped a lot through the year, especially in shallow leagues. And I haven't even mentioned his injury history. Either way, I just don't think he's a good investment, and I wouldn't even stash him if he gets dropped, really. Next up, let's talk about Lad McConkey, or as my wife calls him, Vlad McConkey, which, full disclosure, that's actually what she thought his name was. She's not trying to be funny. But yeah, when it comes to McConkey, I like him as a prospect, but I don't know if I love his value right now. And if anything, I like him better in Dynasty. For example, Draft Sharks has him in the 8th round right now. That's pretty steep for a second round rookie in an offense that's not going to necessarily be an explosive passing offense. Not to mention both him and Herbert didn't get on the field at the same time that much during training camp even. I'm just a little hesitant around his redraft value right now. That's not to say I don't like him obviously in Dynasty, and if anything, I can see him starting to do a lot better towards the middle of the year, which happens with a lot of rookies. So if you're going to take him, you're going to have to hold on to him. And I could see a lot of people potentially getting lucky this year because I can see him getting dropped by impatient fantasy owners. So in the other words, if you're like most people who've drafted by now and you didn't get him, if anything, I'd be trying to trade for him maybe, but I also wouldn't be too upset over not having him. Next up, let's talk about Quentin Johnson. I'm really nervous about what I'm about to say. I think I kind of like him as a sleeper this year. And by sleeper, I mean super duper sleeper. And even by that, I mean more of like a spot fill-in guy kind of sleeper. Considering how poorly his rookie season went, I think it's fair if you're not on board. But it's hard not to get a little excited based on the votes of confidence from Jim Harbaugh and those flashes of athleticism and size. And then when you couple that with the fact that he's going undrafted, he's basically free. Meanwhile, you have to use an 8th rounder, a lad, or an 11th on Josh Palmer. I'd rather take a flyer on a guy like Quentin Johnston. But when I say flyer, I literally mean it. I don't have the highest hopes for him. Just that I like the ROI potential here. Next up, let's talk about the tight ends, and more specifically, Will Dissly. The reason why I said tight ends too is because I think there's going to be someone from this group who ends up being a very productive fantasy player. History has shown Greg Roman has had productive tight ends basically everywhere he's gone. And honestly, tight ends obviously have to be talented, but so much of it is just opportunity and the kind of offense they're in. For example, it's no surprise that Bruce Arians never really had productive tight ends. His pass-happy offense needs blockers. This Greg Roman offense that utilizes the fullback more often and wide receivers blocking gives a lot of catching opportunities to athletic tight ends. Is Dissly that guy? Coming out of college, NFL.com had him as 13th in terms of the athleticism score, and his measurables are not that great. But he did have a sneaky productive 2019 season. He had 4 TDs in just 5 full games. And that wasn't just like some Robert Tonyan kind of season. He was getting some catches too. Not a crazy amount, but still a solid amount. That said, outside of that, he didn't really show that sort of potential again. I personally wouldn't bet on him, but on waivers, he might be worth a shot at some point, especially if he starts showing chemistry with Herbert. So I don't necessarily love him as a prospect this year, but I definitely like him better than Hayden Hurst. I'm not really going to get into because I think that ship has sailed. The tight end who I'm most excited for, by far, is obviously Stone Smartt. One thing I'll say, just in terms of being honest with my audience, I'm a sucker for this one very particular thing, and that's practice squad tight end conversions. And by that I mean when teams try to convert Olympian breakdancers or whatever into tight ends. I always love assuming that there's going to be transferable skills between the two sports, whatever the other sport is in football. But in this case, I honestly don't think it's his dream. I think Stone Smartt is the real deal. And I think the only thing that's going to keep him from having a good fantasy season is whether the coaching staff wants to give him the ball. I can see him being involved as a run blocker a lot, and that might limit his opportunities. Plus, I can see them just straight up spreading the ball around the entire group. What I do think is when he gets his chances, he's going to make a lot from them. And you can see, even in the few times he got a ball thrown to him last year, he did a lot with it. The best part is he's absolutely free. Obviously, it's going to be pretty hard to draw players on your roster right now, considering how deep everyone's team is after a draft. But I would definitely keep him in mind and save some money for him just in case, because I do think he's by far the best candidate to break out amongst his tight end group. And like I said, he's in a Greg Roman offense that has always had a good tight end, basically. Lastly, let's talk about J.K. Dobbins. He's going around the 11th and 12th round, depending on where you look ADP-wise, and I definitely do not like that value. I just don't see him getting in the end zone a lot, and I'm having a tough time seeing him be able to regain that explosiveness after an ACL and Achilles injury. I liked him a lot coming out of college, but at this point, I just don't think it makes sense to take him, especially where he's going. And he's at best a lucky waiver ad that you end up keeping too long after he has a big week. Honestly, I think you'd be better off liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks again for watching.